Hello, everybody, and welcome. It is lovely to share space with you all, with state arts agencies and cultural advocates alike. As some of you know, NASAA does proactive monitoring of state legislation. We track all different kinds of state policies that have the potential to affect the creative sector. And in our scanning, we've lately been seeing a really big spike in legislative activity around event ticketing. Bills that are designed to regulate or deregulate how tickets are sold to consumers. This is a kind of high stakes issue because there is a lot of money to be made on the resale market. So it means there are a lot of different stakeholders involved in these bills at the state level. So today's webinar is going to help us learn more about this trend. We'll hear about the deceptive practices these bills are trying to address, and we'll hear how this issue affects the organizations and the audiences that our field serves. As a general rule, NASAA doesn't get directly involved in state advocacy. We respect state priorities and support what you want to do at the state level. So our goal with this session isn't to endorse or oppose any given bill. We're aiming to help our network just get better equipped to grapple with these complex issues, to be more informed so that we can then pursue whatever solutions are best for us at the state level. I am joined today by two really brilliant colleagues who are going to be our subject matter experts this afternoon. Todd Duesing is president and CEO of Hennepin Arts in Minneapolis. He was part of a coalition that got a ticketing bill passed by the Minnesota legislature last year, one of the more comprehensive bills across the country. He runs 4 venues in the city's theater district that seated more than 270,000 audiences last year. So that's a really, really important part of Minneapolis's creative economy. Kendall Gilvar directs the Fix the Ticks initiative at NEVA, the National Independent Venue Association. Fix the Ticks is a national initiative that advocates to reform ticketing from a consumer point of view. And Kendall is an advisor to many state coalitions who are working on these issues, and she also is an advisor to advocates working to advance federal legislation with Congress as well. So really, really grateful for both Kendall and Todd's willingness to be with us today and to share their expertise. So here's how our hour together is going to roll. First, Kendall is going to get us oriented to the issue. Then Todd will share highlights from the Minnesota story, and we'll treat that as a little bit of a case study. And then Kendall will put that Minnesota example back into a broader national context of how this activity is playing out across other states. And then we'll close with some Q&A at the end. So please be thinking about the questions you want to ask. Make your notes on those questions as we go along. We'll invite those questions for the last 15, 20 minutes or so of the session. So you can put them in the chat, you can raise your hand, but we will do that at the end of the hour. So that's the strategy for today. Kendall, please get us started in this adventure of learning more about state ticketing legislation.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thanks to everyone for joining this call and for inviting me on to speak about ticketing. As I mentioned in the pre-call, I can nerd out about ticketing all day long, so hopefully people stop me. Thanks, Eric, for queuing up these slides. So I guess I'll start by just acknowledging that if you've heard about ticketing bill in your state, you are not alone. This is a huge trend that has come out in the last 2 years. If we could hop over to the first slide, or the second, I should say, we can start identifying some key problems that your organizations that you work with are seeing on a weekly and unfortunately sometimes daily basis. This is potentially going to be a repeat. You might know all of this, but it's helpful to go over vocabulary so that we can eventually put it in a legislative context. So similar to some of the federal legislation that's come out about junk fees, we have seen an increase in bills that addressed opaque pricing. So opaque pricing can be anything from when prices shift during the ticket buying process, when there is no itemization of a fee, when there is little transparency about a fee, Or one of the most egregious examples, in my opinion, when a consumer has to put in their credit card information before they see, the total price or the final price that they will be charged. So that's what we refer to as opaque pricing. Deceptive marketing in URLs is when secondary sellers or resellers take imagery from the artist or the venue that is advertising the show on the primary market, or the IP from those folks, and sets up sort of fake URLs that look really similar to the original seller to convince the average consumer that they are in fact the original seller, to sort of dupe consumers into buying tickets from them and not, the organizations that you all work with that have all the stake into putting on these shows. So there's also an issue with SEOs, which are search engine optimizations. Hope I have that right. That is, the order that a primary market venue or stage, promoter, festival appears in Google or whatever search engine they're using. And I'll walk through an example in a moment. Next, speculative or fake tickets. So speculative tickets is what you'll see if you are engaging in legislation. It's basically any fake ticket. That's when secondary sellers list tickets before an official on sale, when they try to sell consumers tickets that they do not have in their possession yet, either by accessing pre-sales dedicated for fans, or by basically just making up ticket prices in the hopes that they'll be able to secure that ticket. Other examples of fake tickets are tickets that don't scan, that don't get the consumer into a certain seat in the venue, tickets that are sold 4 or 5 times for the same venue or duplicative tickets, and then tickets that have inaccurate seat information, which I have an example of in a little bit. Next slide, please. So not to be all gloom and doom, but there are more problems. Price gouging is something I'm sure you all are all super familiar with. When a ticket is $50 or $75 on a primary market site, and that same ticket is 50 times up to 7,000 times higher on a secondary resale market. That is what happens to the most amount of consumers, we would say. That's the sort of deceptive practice that the highest volume of consumers are facing when they're overpaying for tickets, when oftentimes tickets are still available on the primary market. Next is bots. Bots are actually illegal in the United States, although there is no regulation or enforcement of the Bots Act. There's only been one instance of the Bots Act being enforced. Anecdotally, we know that illegal bots go into primary on sales using dozens of different email addresses or special super expensive ticket buying software to buy up a bunch of tickets so that fans do not have access to them, and then list them on the secondary market for those price gouged rates. Lastly, fan safety issues. As Kelly mentioned, I represent the National Independent Venue Association. We experience a lot of venues who have rain checks or who have specific protocol for safety to protect their fans. And when tickets are listed on the resale market, there's often no avenue for our venues, and I'm sure venues you're familiar with, to contact fans when there are important safety informations or rain delays or bag requirements for, making sure that there's no contraband into the venue. So those are examples of fan safety issues that we see being regulated or deregulated a lot this year and last. Next slide, please. So here are some real examples pulled from this year. A NEVA member is the Howlin' Wolf in New Orleans, Louisiana. Their tickets for this specific show were $50, and on Yelp, they were listed for $746.34, while tickets were still available at the Howlin' Wolf. Next slide, please. Oh, I think, did we skip any? Okay, sorry, I think they might be in a different order. If we could go to the next one potentially. All right, well, we'll go back. I'm sorry. We might have a couple more screenshots on a different slide, but anecdotally, we know, you all know that all of these deceptive practices have a horrible impact on the fans and consumers that we put on shows for. If you go to the Better Business Bureau reviews of secondary sites, you can see hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of consumers being faced with these deceptive practices. For example, got to the theater and found out that my seats were already occupied, paid $203 for tickets that were $25. Where is the consumer protection? I bought tickets from someone who didn't have tickets. And if we could go to the next slide, we know that all of those concerns do not fall on the secondary sellers that have sold those people fraudulent tickets. They fall on the venues, the nonprofits, the PACs, the festivals, and the promoters who are at the door dealing with those consumers and who face the reputation costs of, having to figure out how to get that person a ticket, get them into the venue, and also, protect their bottom line and their save money and make sure that they're not giving away hundreds of tickets that were sold in the secondary market. So impact on industry besides a general distrust between fans and business owners, increased drop rates, fewer tickets actually sold, money out of the live ecosystem. All of these secondary tickets, they don't go back to Maine, they don't go back to Vermont or Ohio, they go out of state and out of the country. And that's been a selling point that's been effective for legislators. Next slide, please. So I think this is one of my last minutes, but I think I will end with this note before turning it over. Here's an example of a fake spec ticket, as we call it. So this is coming out of Massachusetts, it's coming out of Cape Cod. There is a $5,000 orchestra pit ticket listed for a concert that did not even use their orchestra pit for this show. That is how intense these fake tickets get. A fan could have purchased that $5,000 ticket and have had nowhere to sit during the show and would not have been able to get in. So this is what we have been talking about in states across the country. I will hand it over to Todd, who can talk about how y'all regulated all this in your state.
Well, thanks, Kendall. And I'll tell you, that felt really great to see that presentation because it makes me feel good about our legislation because a lot of the points you cover, we actually were able to achieve in Minnesota. So we'll go ahead and pop up the slides that I've brought today. So Minnesota House File 1989, that was selected by Minnesota State Representative Kelly Muller. She and her daughters went through the disaster of the Taylor Swift ticket debacle. And when she went to file a Consumer Protection Act, House File 1989 was open. And so she took it just to play on words even more. But yes, our bill actually originated from a consumer who happened to be an elected official. And then as she brought it to light, more parties jumped on board and we began to build a coalition. So yeah, and we can jump to the next slide, where the question is who is a part of our coalition. So we did have NEVA members for sure. As many of you know, First Avenue is in Minneapolis, and Dana Frank, the CEO of that organization, is quite a strong leader in policy. A lot of her work originated the SVOG funds. And so I would encourage anyone, if you're not a NEVA member, you should be, because NEVA is acting on the best interests of nonprofits and small arts groups, but also clubs and theaters, and has a big interest in protecting the ecosystem that we all enjoy. So in our coalition, we had the NEVA members, nonprofit venues, but there were certain people we decided to leave out of the coalition, and they were kind of in the background. And that was the major athletic teams or presenters. So the Twins and the Vikings, the Timberwolves and the Lynx, they were supportive, but we felt like because they were such a commercial entity, it would draw attention away from this being a Consumer Protection Act. And that's what our main focus was. And we felt as it being delivered as a Consumer Protection Act, it made it easier to pass through both sides of the House. So I will tell you that it's good to keep them involved and informed, which we did. Because at any time they're willing to help financially support the effort. And in a nonprofit world, it's great to have some folks with some cash backing you up if you need it. I will tell you that they did benefit from the language, and that the teams were reviewing the language as it went through to make sure it didn't have any big overreaching parts that could have hurt us all. So who was our opposition per se? Well, it was definitely StubHub, and we would see them at their lobbyists at the Capitol on a regular basis, SeatGeek and Vivid Seats. And all three had lobbyists on site. StubHub is currently pushing an amendment, which I'll talk about later. But one group I noted that we didn't make a part of the coalition was Live Nation, and that's because of the ownership of Ticketmaster, and it was a perceived conflict. They did have a lobbyist speak at one of the hearings as we wrapped up towards the end, but they kind of laid low through the whole thing. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. So our legislative journey. So this all came about from a legislator. I think in some cases now we're seeing it coming from consumer protection groups. We're seeing it coming from venues. I don't think there's any real original necessary point of origination. We were fortunate that we had Representative Mueller, who was very animated in her storytelling and giving examples. And our coalition also brought out some families that had been impacted, particularly when we had the NCAA Big Ten women's tournament, because young female athletes weren't able to afford tickets that were actually affordable, and so because they were bought out on the marketplace by the secondary market. So we moved it, we created the bill, and that bill was created by the legislator, Representative Mueller, who brought a reviser into it. And then we all started to take a look at the language and pass it around through the consortium, the coalition, and make sure that it made sense to all of us, and we added and so forth. At one point, there was a little bit of discussion where some folks didn't agree and so forth, and it was delaying the bill. And the representative made a great move of saying, you all get in the same room and figure this out and let me know when you're ready. And so we had to come to a level of diplomacy together with our eye on the same finish. And that also included having conversations. We went to StubHub, we went to Vivid Seats, we talked to them about how this is going to pan out, because they knew it wasn't going to work in their favor. They just wanted to make sure they could still operate. So quickly moving through these, we went through committee actions in the House. The Senate had a matching bill, but the House filed 1989. The number alone made it more exciting to talk about. So the Senate bought into the House file, and we moved it through the Senate. It did get quite a bit of discussion in both both House and Senate Commerce committees, which they picked it apart, and properly so. A lot of folks on the right were picking apart preserving the marketplace, while the folks on the left were discussing preserving the consumer rights and protections. It moved through the Senate and House committee onto civil law and judiciary, and eventually was a final bill that we were ready to go with. Now, when we got to that final bill point, StubHub was really interested in making a revision, and it was too late in the game for that to happen. So I'll tell you about that in a second, but there was a revision that is now being introduced. So, and this deck will be available, so you'll see all the proceedings and times. I really don't want to go one by one because it's just process. But Governor Walz, who you may know of from national popularity recently, Governor Walz signed the bill into law on May 7th at First Avenue, and it went into effect on January 1st, 2025. So the mandatory things that we went for are pretty much all the things that Kendall just talked about. Disclosure of fees was a big part of that, because in the theatrical space, we were seeing a broker fee that you would have to pay regardless of whether or not you got the tickets. So there was someone who was buying subscriptions in a different state, reselling them in the marketplace, and whether they would sell them way in advance, and then if you got them, you got them. But if they didn't get them, you still had to pay a $300 service charge just on brokerage. So, which is now illegal to do in the language in the state of Minnesota. So definitely mandatory disclosures on all the pricing and service charges. The prohibited practices, some other things, they must disclose that they're a reseller or an online marketplace. And we've seen this start to happen with some of the more I would say, ethical resellers just yet. Some are waiting to be corrected by the Department of Commerce, but you can plainly see on their site that they list that they are not the originating box office or that they are a reseller. So that's very helpful for our consumer. Side note is that we did not add the SEOs, and that's something I wish we would have, is to put language about how they could not be the primary locations in the SEOs. But I think we kind of held that back a little bit because we were trying to keep it as a fair marketplace. And one of our Republican state representatives was already not keen on the idea of trying to control SEOs, which is a secondary business feature. We also had that you had to disclose that the ticket price may be higher than the original ticket price. That the reseller cannot use images or trademarks or anything that associated or text associated with the place of entertainment or the event. However, they could use just text information about the name of the event, the name of the location, and the date and time. We also put in that they couldn't sell the speculative seats, of course. They cannot sell non-existent seats was pretty plain and bold. Speculative seats, that they had to have the tickets in hand, and that this one was one of the biggest parts, is that, and they could not put it on the secondary marketplace until after the public on sale, which was a big deal. And then also they couldn't create any dummy sites. And by dummy sites, we were running into, let's say we have Ann Juliet, the theatrical, there would be websites, Minneapolis, hashtag Ann Juliet tickets, and they would buy the SEO position on the very top for that. And so people were going there to buy their tickets. And what we would have to do before we launched like a Broadway season, because that was that's our primary bread and butter, we would have to go out and spend roughly about $10,000, sometimes upwards of 20, depending on the number of weeks, to buy sites and keep them and hold them tight. So as much as we could throughout the season for Broadway shows and big hits as we knew them. So we no longer have to do that because they can't make the dummy sites. We did talk about the Bots Act, but it yielded back to the national platform on bots. So the enforcement status is very new. And one thing that we learned is that it's being enforced through the Secretary of Commerce's office and the Commerce Department. And in state government, much like anywhere, you probably have this, is that this much enforcement requires people to enforce, and it's not pre-budgeted. So what we've been working on as of recent is reporting to the enforcement division of the Secretary of Commerce where we're running into it and what we're seeing, and they're developing a fine system which will bring in enough revenue to pay for the staffing required to supervise this. So in initial conversations, even on a first offense, it was to the tune of $10,000. And that doesn't sound very much to a big company, but to us, it sounds like a lot. So, and that's what we can portray to the Commerce Department, is that it's got to be hefty fines if we really want it to stop, which was kind of music to the Commerce Department's ear, because they want to be able to capitalize on it if they have to enforce it. So the enforcement is still something we're working on. We at present, if you go to sites, you can find stuff that has our shows on it, and we continue to report them. And then we're also at the point where there's already an amendment, and the amendment is kind of interesting because, as I mentioned, StubHub has an interest in it, and it's because there's language that you cannot put the ticket on sale until after the public on sale, unless you're the originating ticket office or venue where it originated from. And the challenge with that, and my venues are an example of that, is we're in a relationship with Ticketmaster. Love it or hate them, like that's where we are, but they have their own secondary marketplace. So because we publicly we sell advanced tickets for subscriptions or pre-sale, they can actually go ahead and put on the secondary marketplace before their competitors, because they are the originating ticket office or ticket system. So the language that's been presented by StubHub and being worked through is that it would eliminate a whole section that has a lot of meat about speculative ticketing, And we're either going to kill that bill or try to get a revision of the bill where it just says no secondary market can go on sale, regardless of originating box office, until the public on sale. And it wasn't our intent to give Ticketmaster an advantage. Our intent was to protect consumers. Their revision makes it where it wipes out more consumer protection. Ours, if we were able to kill it or make an amendment that we can agree on, would just create a fairer marketplace. And I would say, StubHub isn't wrong, but their approach is all encompassing, trying to wipe out a whole very deep section of the bill. And so that's where we are enforcement status. Now, let me give you a little more background on what this looks like in some cases. Next slide, please. So this will stun you a little bit. And a mega theatrical production, so think of big theatricals like Hamilton and others. We have a 6-week engagement that we've been using as a case study. And we had interns in that made a project of this where they tracked 14 websites. They found and we still aren't on sale with this particular event. So that tells you where we are in this. There were 48,615 tickets that they found. An average ticket price was $857. The high end on the ticket scope for the tickets that we have in our pricing system is $150. The average extra fee charge was $28.96. The total amount that is out on the secondary market before we're on sale is nearly $41.5 million out on the marketplace. So it's pretty big bucks out there that they're out selling. We also found instances where there were shows on sale for a date that we don't have a show. So that was on the secondary market. Multiple rows that didn't exist are out there in the public space. And so it was really challenging to see that and see this happening to our consumers. And so that's where we're really working hard before our public on sale in a couple months to get these enforcement numbers in and really nail down these challenges. But I venture to guess it's still going to take some time to really get the enforcement down to a perfect equation. So my tidbit on that would be prepared to spend some money on a lobbyist. It definitely takes a lobbyist, particularly if you have a coalition. It's great to have some folks who are on the for-profit side, would be my suggestion if you're advising your nonprofit arts groups and so forth, because they're going to be affected by this as well. I would definitely lean on NEVA as a resource and for information, and your NEVA partners in the state. You should be a NEVA member. If you're a venue, I would tell your venues that, but become a NEVA member because they'll give you all the details. And it will be more effective because you can replicate the process in other states, which will make it happen much smoother and easier. And that it takes some time and that it's not done when it's done. We'll probably continue to be working with the legislature for several years to make sure that the enforcement happens. So happy Tuesday. Thank you so much. I'll hand it back over to Kendall, who can give some tidbits about how this impacts you.
Thanks, Todd. I think we're getting my other slides queued up as well. It's good to see also some familiar faces that I know are already working on ticketing this session. I see some names, so it's good to, rely on your colleagues that are actively working on ticketing. So I don't want to get too much into specific legislative provisions because Todd did a great job of breaking down a lot of the similarities of what we're looking for. However, NEVA has worked with the Fix the Ticks Coalition. For background, the Fix the Ticks Coalition, as Kelly said, is a broader arts organization group like Recorded. There are some artist rights organizations in there, as well as some independent ticketing companies, as well as NEVA and others. So we put together model legislation that we believe represents NEVA's and Fix the Ticks interests. I urge you all to see if it represents your interests. My gut is that it does, but double check. Fixtheticks.org is where you can find a breakdown of resources like this. We also have a how to pitch your legislators guide that sort of gets at the talking points and what legislators want to hear. If we could go to the next slide. Again, I won't go through each one since Todd did a great job, but We want to see a ban on fake tickets, a ban on those spoof websites that, appear like the primaries. We want to see face values and fees being itemized at the beginning of ticket sales. That's really important for the artist groups that we work with as well. We want professional resellers to register at the state level so that folks know who they're buying a resold ticket from, and that so those resellers can be held accountable down the line if they do violate consumer protection. Next slide, please. We want to require secondary sellers to refund tickets that don't admit fans to a show. Seems like that should be self-explanatory, but it's not. Fans are not getting their refunds in a timely manner. They're not getting refunds at all. We want state agencies to have some sort of portal or reporting mechanism for fans, artists, and venues to report violations of whatever act is being enshrined in states. We want strong enforcement provisions and fines, like Todd mentioned. We want to address price gouging. Next slide, please. And then what we don't want as NEVA and Fix the Ticks, unlimited transferability is a way legislatively for the secondary sellers to basically enshrine their ability to resell the same ticket over and over again for 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the price. We also want venues to be able to contact, like I said, the consumers that are in their venues for safety protocol reasons. We do not want speculative or fake ticket bans with fine print disclosures. There has been a huge trend of speculative ticket bans across the country that a lot of times are being fueled by the secondaries because there's loopholes you could drive a truck through, as we say at NEVA. We don't want those bills. We want artists and venues to be able to set their specific terms and conditions for those tickets, and for those resold tickets to follow those terms and conditions. And yeah, we want refunds, as I mentioned. All of this is also available at fixtheticks.org. Next slide, please. So thinking more largely about why this is happening and what's going on and why this is happening everywhere. So to take a step back, we internally are monitoring 60 plus ticketing bills across 25 states introduced in the 2025 session. For comparison, I did the same job last year and there were about 17 ticketing bills that were introduced in the 2024 session. So at least the ones that we monitored. So why so many? First, anecdotally, we know that during COVID-19 pandemic, the secondary resellers took the time when there were no shows happening to professionalize their bot software, to professionalize their resale practices, and to invest in predatory reselling as an industry, not just as, oh, I can't make the concert, I'm going to resell my ticket. No, people have dozens of consumers, thousands of email addresses. I don't even begin to understand all the technology that goes behind it, but there's a lot. There's also been interest, specifically in the Biden administration, to get rid of junk fees across industries. So that's hit travel, plane tickets, even restaurants are now, being looked at to decipher their junk fees. This is an interesting issue when it comes to arts organizations, because we know that there's a difference between a junk fee, a processing fee from StubHub of $15 for a virtual ticket, and then a fee to pay your staff or to clean the restrooms or to put on the show that you're managing. So there is some education that has to happen around ticketing and junk fees. Taylor Swift, need I mention why the Taylor Swift Ticketmaster debacle, brought up ticketing, but it's still having an impact. I still went to a hearing last week where they were introducing a Taylor Swift bill that would have screwed over a lot of people in our industry. Sometimes Taylor Swift bills are good, sometimes they're bad. You have to use your discretion. And then also the reason for this uptick in bills is that certain secondary sites are also using these other things like the junk fee rulings to capitalize on enshrining legislation that might hurt consumers or your arts organization. So as much as we are proposing pro-consumer ticketing bills, the other side's also proposing pro-secondary ticketing bills. And I'll chat about that in a little bit. Like Todd mentioned, the key players we're seeing in state discussions across the country are local stages, artists, consumers, NEVA, arts organizations, artist organizations as well, secondary sites like StubHub, Vivid Seats, SeatGeek, Ticket Center, We are also seeing multinational conglomerates like Live Nation show up at the table, as well as what I have in quotations as consumer groups. Over the last couple of years, we have noticed that there are a number of groups that come forward and present as consumer groups, but when you track their funding, they are oftentimes funded by StubHub, Vivid Seats, or the secondaries, although their title makes it seem like they are pro-consumer or pro-fan. So if you'd like a list of those groups, email me after. I'm happy to discuss further. But again, there needs to be a lot of discernment when working on ticketing legislation because there are a lot of players, and it's good to know where those players get their funding. Next slide, please. Getting involved in your state, I'll go through this quickly. Like Todd said, do build coalitions and relationships with state legislators months and years in advance of when you would like to introduce a ticketing bill. I know that might not be what you want to hear, but all of this education has to start early. It's complicated, as you all know, and there's a lot of nuance to these bills. Gather evidence, collect stories in your state of consumers and arts groups that have been duped by these secondary sites. Screenshots and actual fan stories are really great. Playing defense. If there is a state bill that you've noticed that would enshrine fake tickets or empower the use of bots, it's more important to play defense against those bills than to start working on a bill introduction for 2026, because those bills can pass this session and they'll get ahead of those positive bills. So play defense. Again, like Todd said, understand the costs, show up to hearings. They want to hear from arts organizations. They want to hear from consumers in their states. So rallying constituents of those groups to tell their stories is always really powerful at the state level. And then have a list of non-negotiables that you will not budge on in terms of your ticketing legislation, and then things that you could sort of pass on. They don't really matter to your groups. You can read the don'ts. Don't spend all your lobbying dollars in month one. Don't fall for buzzwords like pro-consumer or pro-fan or the Protect Ticket Act. Words like that, you know, they might seem like pro-consumer ticketing bills, but when you actually start to read them, they might go against your interests. So make sure that you're very careful and very, just skeptical of different bills. Again, don't trust organizations that you've never heard of. Do your research. If you're at the table with a state legislator and there's a group who you don't know, who they are or where they're coming from, look them up. Don't assume everyone has positive intentions. And to end on a positive note, don't go at it alone. NEVA is really working hard on this. There's a number of arts organizations, artist organizations that are working on ticketing legislation across the country. We have model legislation that you can take bits and pieces from, rely on those who have passed positive legislation before you. And that's all I have.
If I could add one thing, Kendall, I think you raised a good point, is one thing to do is with the larger conglomerates like StubHub and Vivid Seats and so forth, they're going to have lobbyists around, and get to know them and have hallway conversations to see what their objective is, because they're a big organization. They're going to invest money in it, and their intention is to continue to operate. What is also that we shouldn't forget, like, while those names are known, there are so many independent underground individuals that, like, we would, anytime you get sales from another state, it's these fake predators who are going out and sitting in a basement in a computer somewhere in someone's home buying this whole marketplace. And so I think don't lose sight of the individual who is doing it, or the small enterprise that isn't the big enterprise, because they are the ones who are doing the most damage on the upcharging and the non-disclosure. I would also say too that what we did, and I would recommend to for case study point or for evidence, if you were recommending to your arts groups, is on a bigger show like a Hamilton or Wicked or something, there's typically a lot of secondary tickets sold that don't work at the box office or didn't work, and people come to the box office looking for a refund or to be adjusted, and you just don't have seats. We actually made a point to have a police officer at the box office who could do police reports on site because with a police report, the consumer could go right to the credit card company and do a chargeback. And so that helped to the small time guys who were, bad predators. It would help shut them down because they wouldn't get the funds anymore, or it would be reversed. So just a little tidbit.
Well, thank you so much, Todd and Kendall, to both of you for what you've shared. It's really given me a much deeper appreciation for the importance of this issue, the complexity of this issue, how kind of cultural policy and the evolution of technology and popular issues are all converging in this moment for a real proliferation of legislation, which regardless of where we fall in a continuum about it, we've got to be able to navigate it and understand it for sure. So let's progress into Q&A. We've got a number of questions in the chat. I'm tracking on those. We'll get to them. And if you have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. But let's start with this one. Patrick in Arizona asked a question that was very much on my mind as well. So when an elected official or anybody makes the point that regulation of free markets isn't a successful strategy or isn't a desirable strategy, what is your response to that? Let's talk a little bit about this issue of regulating free markets versus allowing them to be free, and how that debate comes into the creative sector on this issue. So I don't know, Kendall, if you want to go first, or Todd, if you want a piece of this, what are your thoughts?
Sure.
Go
ahead, Todd.
I have a quick example. We had a Republican senator who actually opposed the legislation because of that. And the first thing we did was call him and met him for coffee and talked through, answered all his questions. It really comes down to ticketing is really complex in the end, and not everyone understands all the details. So in sitting down with him, we explained to him and showed him details of how, how the predator actors were hurting our consumers. And he actually backed off a little bit from some of his concerns, but wanted to keep it still a free marketplace. So he did his due diligence and did what he needed to do as a protector of freedom of business, but also understood that there was something really foul going on, because we took the time to meet with him for an hour and debate through everything.
Mm-hmm. Kendall, and then I see your hand up for a follow-up, Patrick.
Yep, I totally agree with that. I'll start by saying everybody loves some kind of music at the federal level, or comedy or performance at the federal level and the state level. It's been actually beneficial to research the preferred genre or style of music that specific legislator likes, and then finding constituents in their arenas who put on that type of music and explain the consumer protection issue here. So first, arts brings people together, as we all know. Everybody wants affordable tickets. Most consumers want affordable tickets, even if they are, for the most part, anti-regulation. And lastly, I'll add that no other industry, we talk about airlines. You cannot sell an airline ticket that you don't have possession of. You cannot sell an airline ticket before that plane, has that specific flight has been announced. There are a number of regulation issues in the ticketing world that have not been caught up in comparison to other industries. And like Kelly mentioned, that is because the internet has outpaced legislators, specifically in this arena. So when you compare it to other regulatory industries, this is probably the most egregious example of consumer protection. And yeah, I'll end there.
Great, thank you. Patrick, do you have a quick follow-up? Oops, we can't hear you. Hold on a second. Eric, can you help Patrick unmute?
I am also
Ah,
having trouble.
there we go.
There we
Okay,
go.
there we go. Thank you.
There we go.
One of the things that one of the reasons I asked the question is without going into details, we had a bill passed last year. So there was a new law on the books in Arizona that somewhere between the comprehensive fix the ticks and I mean it did a little bit. How effective we don't know. SubHub was back this year trying to get it amended, and so they had a legislator sponsor that bill. This legislator is a Republican who is historically very anti-regulation. He actually was out of the legislature for 2 years, so he wasn't around when they did last year's bill, but he was around this time. And the whole reason he introduced the bill is because he had an experience. It was an athletic ticket, but that's that he goes to SubHub. What happened? We need to write a law. That's why we're in the room. But here's what I want to say. The battle in this legislation this year really was between Ticketmaster and StubHub, their lobbyists. We entered the room to say, look, the bill you introduced would be horrible for arts organizations, but you could fix it. He was very open to that. And so we were very fortunate that we could get the bill amended. Ultimately, it failed because other Republicans were opposed to the regulation. But we plan to work with the legislator next year. And this has been very helpful because we'd like to do even more regulation next year. And obviously he's willing to do some, so maybe he could do a little more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. I also want to just follow up a little bit on this theme of kind of free markets with a question that Susan from Vermont has put into the chat, which is about public education. Do you have examples of successful public education campaigns? She observes that while some electeds have been supportive, there are others who are skeptical that regulation alone will fix this issue, that it also requires consumer education. So are there strategies that are successful on that side of the equation?
I'll start off briefly by saying we agree that this legislation also needs to come with consumer education. Unfortunately, most consumers don't care until they're duped. And then when they're duped, they care a whole lot. So one thing that a couple NEVA venues have done and that we're trying to sort of make into a NEVA-wide, practice is having a one-pager that you can hand over to consumers, like Todd said, when they show up to the venue and they are duped. I think educating consumers when they're at their angriest is how you get them to advocate. So I'll say, that is where we begin. Accessing consumers who have not been duped is tricky because why would they care to participate to, regulations? But there are a lot of consumers who come to us and we get lots of emails. Yeah, Todd, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that, because of the way our bill came about from a legislator who had the experience, we were beneficial of not having to do a lot of public campaigns. We did exactly what Kendall said. Whenever we would encounter it at the ticket office, we would inform the patrons and do our best to support them in reclaiming their money. But I do think that there are campaigns that I've seen in other places. At my previous location in Ohio, we had a campaign that we did throughout with our ticket office to warn people about secondary ticket markets. I know a lot of performing arts centers have done that. It's usually like some picture of a guy in a trench coat with a bunch of tickets inside. It says like, watch out for the bad sellers. So yeah. Real quick too, going back to Patrick's comment about the legislators and how they had StubHub had worked with them. One thing to keep in mind is while I speak highly of StubHub being open to discussion, in the revision they have right now, they actually have financially supported 2 Republicans and 2 DFL Democrats in being the authors of the language of the revision. They're low ranking as far as their seniority and impact on the state system as far as as leaders, but they went and threw some money at them to get a co-sponsored bill. So be aware of that too.
If I could add one more thing about consumer engagement, artist engagement also helps activating consumers. We had a Fix the Ticks day of action where we got Billie Eilish to repost an Instagram story of our Fix the Ticks like infographic. And that was the highest number of clicks we've gotten on our Fix the Ticks site ever. So, you know, people love their artists. So if you have artists in your states that could help speak out about this, that's always effective.
Love the creative engagement strategy there. So Todd, on this theme of amendment, on this theme of changing the legislation that was enacted just last year, question from Karen in Washington State: if you had to write HB 1989 today, applying what you've learned along the way, would you write it differently? What changes would you make?
You know, I think there's not really, because I feel good, and I think that what NEVA has put out as a prescription or a checklist it worked out well because we fell into most of those boxes and followed that lead. So I think giving them a nod of excellence. I think if you follow NEVA's bullets, you're in good shape. One thing that we didn't have on there that was brought up was the registration at the state, and that I regret that we didn't get that in. But also, after the bill was complete and we met about enforcement with the Secretary of Commerce's enforcement division, we let them know that that was something we were disappointed that we didn't have, we failed to do. And so they're looking at it from a different angle of resellers have to have a license in Minnesota anyway, so perhaps that we can get this done through a licensing perspective.
Interesting. So we've also had a couple of questions kind of about this, the relationship between federal legislation and state legislation, because we know that there have been some bills that have been floated in Congress at the federal level. What do you see as the ideal combination? Is it important to keep advancing state legislation, or is there some likelihood that that's going to be overwritten and overridden by federal legislation? How do you see that policy environment playing out? Kendall, do you want to take a swing at that one?
Sure. So Fix the Ticks started by advocating at the federal level. We've only started state legislation this year, like in you know, the most amount of action. We would love to see federal legislation that addresses everything in the checklist that we talked about today. We worked to introduce the Senate Fans First Act, which is reflective of a lot of the things that we talked about today. Unfortunately, because of the political climate at the moment, we are not seeing that bill advance as much as another ticketing bill called the Ticket Act, which has been introduced by Senator Ted Cruz. We, as a coalition, are working with hopefully Cruz's office to amend that Ticket Act to properly protect consumers. There are a number of things in that bill that we don't think that bill goes far enough. I'll say that, and feel free to look at our statements on our site. So in the meantime, yes, the states are where it's at. There's no federal legislation swooping in anytime soon to properly protect consumers, at least for 2025, potentially, in the next year as well. The states are advancing a lot quicker than the federal level. And we can also see that affirmed by the secondary sellers investing a lot of money in the states. If you follow the money, you can follow the trends. And we're seeing disengagement at the federal level because of a sort of slowdown of government that we've seen across many industries. And, again, investment in the states.
Yeah, we are seeing similar things. And then just one final question for each one of you. If you are thinking a little bit about the interests of small presenters and large presenters, right? So the really tiny nonprofits, which a lot of people on this call support, with state arts agency grantees being a lot of small groups, right? How do those interests converge or diverge from larger organizations, right? Do they need different things from this kind of legislation? I'm just wondering, Todd or Kendall, if either of you have thoughts on that question.
I can start off on that one. So I would say in the grand scheme of things, the major level is the sports venues and arenas and so forth that do large concerts. We're mid-level in the theatrical world, and the clubs and small theaters, less than 500 seats, are on the smaller side. I feel like we have an ecosystem where we have to look out for one another, and we have different levels of finance in our organizations. So as being the middle child, I would say we wanted to keep the bigger child out of it because of the political commercialization questions and so forth. And we were the nonprofits, but we also realized in our responsibility that some of the smaller theaters and clubs don't have the kind of budgets to afford lobbyists necessarily. So I think we have to remind ourselves that we are an ecosystem, and we have to support our friends at another level, because in the ecosystem, those are the next artists to play the theater. And if we're not protecting their sales at a lower level, then they'll never make their way to us, and the same goes upward. So I think that, is there a perfect process? No, but you kind of have to have that gut check of this is the responsibility you play in the ecosystem. And but what is also meaningful is to have small businesses like smaller clubs or theaters at the table to speak to their legislators, particularly like in Minnesota. We were having small theaters from around the state talk to people, and it wasn't just the Twin Cities metropolitan, and that got the work done because you need them uh to have their voices heard as well, to their representation.
That's right. That's right. I really appreciate you making the point about the importance of rural relevance when seeking to enact statewide legislation. Good point. Kendall, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd echo Todd. NEVA members range from capacities of 100 to capacities of 6,000. It's affecting nearly all of our members. It's also affecting the large arenas in our states. However, when you see a increased drop rate of 30% in a span of 6 months, sometimes, the smaller venues have a more direct financial impact from that drop rate than a large arena who could, miss 6 rows, 8 rows of fans, and it really wouldn't affect their bottom line for that show. So if you're seeing smaller venues show up more, or independent venues and nonprofits and PACs show up more, it's because their businesses are on the line at higher rates than the larger PACs and arenas. It doesn't mean that it's affecting anyone any less. It's just maybe a higher concern. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the smaller your budget, the more, disproportionate impact is if something affecting 20 seats, right? So yeah, I hear you for sure. Well, I think that's bringing us just about to the top of the hour. So this is a wrap for today. Todd and Kendall, I'm so very grateful that you could join us. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Thank you for sharing your insights about this realm of policy. And thanks to everybody on the call for coming as well.